Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ernest Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our video. The long-anticipated return of college basketball season is almost at its end, and that is no exception for Hoosier fans. They are always excited when Indiana basketballs return, and me and Jacob Root of Locked On Hoosiers decided to sit down and talk about the Indiana basketball season in 2023-2024. There's a lot of changes. No more Trace Jackson Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino, but in is Mackenzie Mgbako and Kel'el Ware. And Mike Woodson, he is tasked to be able to continue to have Indiana basketball playing as one of the better teams in the Big Ten and possibly in college basketball if he can get the Hoosiers back to the top of the sport. And we both break down whether we think Indiana will make the tournament in college basketball this year and how good of a job Mike Woodson has done as the head coach of Indiana overall. You mentioned the transition from Archie Miller to Mike Woodson, how important that is because Indiana has been doing a better job lately with him. What do you think the pulse is on the IU fan base of how Mike Woodson is doing? Is he like blowing their expectations out of the water? Has he kind of done about what people thought, or is he, underperformed based on what people were expecting him to do so far at Indiana?
I don't know that there's any other way to frame it other than just a complete success so far. I was one of those that was very skeptical about his hiring. I wasn't certain that they did a great job kind of casting a wide enough net and talking to enough people. And then I had concerns about Mike Woodson himself in that, I mean, he's older. He's someone who didn't have any sort of college basketball experience. And there's certain things you got to have to adapt to in the college game. Recruiting was big amongst them. And I was wrong about all of it. Like, he's knocked it all out of the park. Excuse me. He has been incredible from the moment he stepped on campus. And I mean, to that point, getting Trace Jackson Davis to stick around and potentially be that foundation that he can build the program on has been enormous. And then it's going to be interesting now because I think expectations are changing with him. That first season, certainly nobody had a clue what to expect. And for him to get him back to the tournament was fantastic. Last season, you can write off a certain degree of injuries and that leading to them underperforming a bit. But now he's going to have, I think, a lot more expectation. There's been plenty of talk about him changing the way Indiana is going to play moving forward. And so now he's going to, I don't want to say the honeymoon period is over necessarily, but he's kind of set a really high bar for what to expect from this program under him now. And he's going to have to continually meet that bar. Now, I there's no reason to believe that he won't do that. And he's continuing to bring in incredibly talented players and top recruits and things like that. So I'm still confident in that he can do it. But about this time 2 years ago, I had a lot of questions about Mike Woodson. And now I sit here ecstatic that he came back to Bloomington because it has been fantastic these last 2 years having him around.
Yeah, I think it's a interesting point you bring up about with Mike Woodson. You didn't know what to expect, and because I remember when he got hired, and I mean there was a lot of speculation. I remember the Brad Stevens rumors and all that. I mean that wasn't likely at all. And I even saw Chris Beard. I was even seeing Porter Moser, which some people were saying that would be Archie Miller 2.0. Who knows on that regard because obviously wasn't hired, so we won't know how that would have worked. But Mike Woodson was definitely out of left field. It wasn't expected at all. And, he has so much coaching experience, more than a lot of people, I think, realized in the fact that he was an NBA coach for 10 years. He was an assistant coach for, the other 20 years. So he's been in the NBA as a coach for like 30 years. He played, obviously. So he's got like 4 decades of NBA experience. So in that regard, I mean, he's a great hire, but he didn't have college experience in coaching at all. So, like, that's what made him wouldn't say a red flag, but just more of a mystery. How is he going to do? But I do think that he has, like you said, it's been a success. He's overperformed, but now the bar has been raised. And if he can't meet the expectation or keep, moving up or having Indiana keep improving, it could create some, friction with the fan base if he can't continue to have Indiana go in the right direction. But I think so far he has done a really solid job to your point. Now, the next question about Mike Woodson and what he's done in Indiana basketball. Have they returned to national relevance? And I know that doesn't really matter because of the fact that at the end of the day, the media is going to talk about who they want to talk about the most. But do you feel like Indiana has returned to national relevance?
It's a interesting debate. I think they're probably on the fringes of it right now. Last season was set up, I think, in a way where if they had met expectations, they probably would return to that conversation. To me, it's your Dukes, your Kansases, your Gonzagas, UNCs, schools like that are kind of the inner circle right now. And there's programs that'll shuffle in and out of that and whatnot. But that to me is kind of the group that Indiana needs to pull itself towards. In some ways, they're doing that. I certainly think on the recruiting trail, they're absolutely doing that, and they're getting in. Not even just getting in the door; they're actively being considered by top recruits, which is a huge win for Mike Woodson and that coaching staff. So in that regard, they're nationally relevant, I guess, but you have to turn that into on-court success as well. And if you bring in enough of those top recruits, eventually that'll happen. But I would say they're probably on the fringes right now. They're certainly a lot more relevant than they were at the end of the Archie Miller era. I don't know that. I mean, I don't even know they were Big Ten relevant at that point. They were struggling mightily at the end of that. And Mike Woodson has brought them back to being a program that is respected at the very least, which I don't know that was the case a couple years ago. And he certainly is building something here. It feels like there's another step they're going to need to take to get to nationally relevant. It probably includes winning a Big Ten title, whether probably a regular season one. I don't know how much people care about a Big Ten conference tournament. So there's probably another step there they need to make or make a deep run in the tournament, but they're more respected and they have a better reputation nationally. Does that make them relevant? I guess, again, it's kind of subjective, but I would say they're probably on the fringes right now.
That makes sense. I mean, Indiana was really close to winning the Big Ten last year. I mean, they were, like you said, an injury that hurt, especially with Xavier Johnson, and then Race Thompson got banged up for a stretch there. I mean, they had like 3 or 4 games they lost by like a couple points last season. And if they win those games, they win the Big Ten. They were very close. They swept Purdue. So when they were at their best, they were the best team in the Big Ten last season at their best, but they just weren't healthy. And sometimes even when they were, they didn't play, elite basketball. But when they were healthy at the beginning of the season, they beat Xavier on the road. They beat North Carolina in the Big Ten ACC Challenge. Rest in peace of that. But, I mean, I think that overall, Indiana definitely was a really good team last year. There's just a small way away from being a lot better than they were, and that would have definitely helped in the national relevance regard. But it is what it is. Can't go back. Definitely the future is going to be, I guess you would say, decisive in making Indiana nationally relevant again. And that starts with the next season's Hoosiers. And this question, I have no idea how you're going to answer this question, so it's going to be really interesting who you pick. But for next season's team, obviously last year you could you make an argument Trace Jackson Davis by far was the most important player. But for this year's team, who do you think is the most important player for Indiana basketball next season in determining their success next year?
Most important is an interesting way to phrase it because I think there's 2 names that come up. Kel'el Ware would be one of them. And I spoke about this recently on the podcast. If Indiana is going to win a Big Ten title, like we were kind of discussing, he's going to have a really big season. But to me, I think most important is going to be Xavier Johnson because there's a lot of things Indiana doesn't have. They don't have a ton of experience. They have only a couple point guards, and he's one of them. And they don't really have that kind of leader, that on-court leader as much. They lost that with Trace and Race and Miller Kopp. And Xavier Johnson represents all of those things. And even when Trace was here, this team largely went as Xavier Johnson went the last couple of seasons. When he played well, Indiana tended to play really well. And when he struggled, Indiana tended to struggle. I think that's going to be amplified this year with how important he's going to be to the team, but also the way Indiana is going to play. If they're spreading things out and the ball's going to be in his hands more and you're running some more pick and rolls and driving kicks and things like that, there's a lot of responsibility and pressure on him and expectation on him to play well. I think he's certainly capable of it, but the Xavier Johnson ride has been a roller coaster at times during his, well, not at times, basically the whole time he's been at IU. So I expect there to be some more up and downs, but I do think he's probably the most important player on this team next season.
That makes sense. I mean, Xavier Johnson's been a very interesting player anyway, for me, watching college basketball last 4 or 5 years and him, being a part of it. I remember when he was at Pitt, he had a season in his freshman year. He had like 14, 15 points per game. I mean, he was on NBA draft radars and stuff like that. So, I mean, he's a guy that has a lot of talent. Granted, Pitt did not have as many good players around him as, he did it. He still has in Indiana. And that's why he scored more. But he is definitely a guy capable of taking over a game, relatively speaking, not completely, but he can certainly add to that. But like you said, he is mightily inconsistent. And sometimes, like that one game, I think it was in 2021 against Wisconsin, where he was like 1 of 13, shooting in that game. He just could not make a shot, and Indiana collapsed because they were winning that game by like 20. And then they ended up losing in the second half in the Kohl Center, which they still haven't won there since '98, which is insane. But I think that overall, looking at Xavier Johnson, like you said, if Indiana is going to have a really good season next year, he has to play well most nights. It is definitely, a must-have for sure. I think that, like you said, Kel'el Ware, I think Mackenzie and Mgbako, those guys are going to be really important, but a lot of their success will be determined on how Xavier Johnson plays, which makes 110% for sure. I think that another interesting question about the roster before we, start talking about how you think they're going to do next season, but do you think that CJ Gunn or Caleb Banks next year has a bigger likelihood of breaking out and having more success next season?
Right now, I would say I wouldn't be surprised. I think both of them will have some role. I would say CJ Gunn mainly because of opportunity. I don't know. I mean, right now, IU's guard rotation is kind of a big question mark. You have Trey Galloway, you have Xavier Johnson, you have Gabe Cupps as the backup point guard. I'm not sure who the backup shooting guard is right now, which it could be CJ Gunn. Ja'Kai Newton could be. It sounds like his knee injury is probably going to limit him quite a bit this summer. So I would say he's going to be starting behind the 8 ball. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for CJ Gunn early on to take a step forward and be that guy. Because of that, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he played a pretty decent sized role this season. What I would say as well is that the new kind of way this offense is going to look, relying more on athleticism, getting guys into space, things like that, that really suits Caleb Banks as well. So I think both of them very much could have kind of breakout sophomore seasons, but I would say it's probably more likely for CJ Gunn, if only because I think the opportunity is going to be there more.
Yeah, 100%. Because the backcourt, is a bit thin, like you said. I mean, I was a bit shocked that Indiana did not fill that spot because they only have one roster spot available. They have 12 spots, and Mike Woodson did a phenomenal job filling up this roster with talented players. But I think that it is interesting that spot didn't get filled. Do you think it's more likely that that spot did not get filled because Mike Woodson's leaving that spot for the 2024 class, or do you think that he just wasn't able to get a guy that fit the system or something like that?
It's probably the latter. I think that there were specific guys, I guess, that you target. You don't go out there and say, "Oh, you're a guard, come in," because there's all kinds of dynamics, obviously, at work. But I think that there were players they were looking at, and they turned the Hoosiers down, and the transfer portal moves so quickly that you might be focusing on a guy over here, and somebody you thought was plan B over here commits, and suddenly if you lose out on plan A, plan B isn't there, then you got to figure out a plan C. And I think that's just kind of the way things panned out for Mike Woodson and the staff. I was a little surprised that they didn't get anybody, but I mean, as you said, I guess the added benefit is it's an extra scholarship you can offer to the 2024 class, which IU is doing a ton of work in and are in the mix with a number of the top guys in that class. So maybe it works out in the long run. But I would say that it's a guard that they probably would have certainly they were targeting with that last scholarship spot, which would kind of answer some of those questions. Even with CJ Gunn, and even if you think he is set for a breakout season and a bigger role, that's really 4 guards. Ja'Kai Newton, depending on what his availability is going to be, 4.5, 5 guards that you have on the roster. It's not a lot. And so it does leave IU a little shorthanded. And if injuries come up again, which knock on wood, but it's been a recurring thing the last couple seasons, if injuries come up again, it leaves you in a bit of a pinch. But I certainly don't think the plan was to leave that spot open.
Yeah, it makes 100% of sense. I mean, because the roster is very thin. I mean, you got Anthony Leal as well. I know a lot of Indiana fans talk about him, and he is a fantastic representative of the university, but he's just never has broken out to the point of playing significant minutes. He had that one game against Wisconsin where he had 9 points, but outside of that, in his freshman year, he just has not contributed a lot. If he doesn't, is not able to contribute this year much as well, that will be interesting for sure. But we talked about the roster. We talked about how Mike Woodson is doing. So based on everything that you've seen with the roster so far, and obviously it is impossible to be able to project how, they're going to do exactly next season because injuries could happen, or maybe the talent just doesn't mesh together as well as we think it will. Do you think that Indiana will more than likely make the tournament next season? And do you think that they have a shot of being able to win the Big Ten next year? Or do you think that there's no chance at all?
I wouldn't say no chance. I think this team has a lot of questions, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the first couple of weeks, what some of those games against Kansas and Auburn and some of those bigger games they have scheduled, what the team looks like. Tournament, I feel like, is like that's like a bar you have to clear at this point. Big Ten title contention, Michigan State's really good. Like, and Purdue, as long as whatever 7-footer they have it this time around is there, they're going to be good. So those 2 teams are going to be solid. Indiana could be that good, but there's just so many unknowns with this team this season. As much roster turnover as you had, I mean, when Indiana at the end of the season was playing tournament games and playing must-win games, they were playing 7 guys and 5 of them are gone. So there's just so many questions with this team that I'm not really sure what to expect from them. There's a lot of variance. I could see it going really well, and maybe they are competing for a Big Ten title, but I could see it also struggling and IU fighting to try to get into the tournament. So I'm not really sure what to make of this team. I'm excited to see what it's going to look like because I think if it does go well, it's going to be an exciting brand of basketball with a lot of really good players. IU probably should have 1, if not 2 more first-round picks on the team this season. So a lot of talented players. It's going to be fun to watch. Will it be fun to watch and successful? I guess we'll find out. But there's just so many questions with this team heading into this season.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because of the fact that with Indiana, when Trace Jackson Davis finally was ultimately going to leave, I always felt like Indiana was, especially when Mike Woodson took over, it was going to be a big shift, a big transition over to the guards being the main focus. And it's like this year's team just is not that because Kel'el Ware, because, Malik Reneau, because Mackenzie and Mgbako, they're all forwards and centers, with Kel'el Ware and Malik Reneau, if you classify him as a center. It's just unbelievable that that's still the main focus this year. I was kind of shocked that the roster ended up shaking out that way. But still, like you said, a lot of talent, but talent does not always equate to success. It's going to be really interesting to see. Hopefully Indiana does do really well in basketball, but I would agree with you that I think they should make the tournament. but it'll be interesting how good they actually are. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below how excited you are for the return of Indiana basketball and whether you think that Indiana will be able to make the tournament this year in college basketball and how good of a job you think Mike Woodson has done overall leading the Hoosiers. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.